Oh.
The red light is on, so it is recording. You see REC?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
So I just turn off pause.
Mm-hmm.
We need something new on our campus. Highest esteem. My brother Shuja, Sister Wilder, we not only see each other here, but in several pivotal meetings of the mind to strategize for what to do to meet your goal, articulated goal with energy of education for liberation. And to have you say that, it is unique. I'm, I guess, a member of the education, the teacher educators community now since 1961. And all of that time on campuses all around the country and around the world, I've never heard anybody in teacher education say that their purpose for the process of bringing new educators into being was liberation. I've heard them talk about education for meeting the standards so that no child would be left behind. That's very radically different from education for liberation. In fact, it's a low standard. To measure yourself so that you want to make sure that the achievement gap is eliminated, that's also a very low standard, especially when you're measuring yourself against standards that is the lowest in the industrial world. Mm-hmm. The United States has one of the lowest standards of achievement of any nation out of all the industrial nations. It's almost near the bottom on everything consistently. And so to close the gap, that means closing it on the average achievement of the nation. You've already put a ceiling on where you're going to go. And if you look at how nations are measured, if that's the standard, even if you take the high end, which would be Japan and Singapore, and interestingly enough, Cuba, which has the highest achievement in the world. And this is not paying somebody that you know who's your friend to evaluate your achievement. This is independent evaluator, United Nations. So Cuba didn't evaluate itself. United Nations evaluated Cuba. And I think only on 2 criteria did any nation beat them. In one case, Japan beat them on something. The other case, one of the Scandinavian countries beat them on something. But in all the other cases, they were either even or above everybody in the world. And that follows what Castro did when he followed a liberation pattern for Cuba. If you remember, before that revolution, the children of Cuba, they couldn't even go on the beaches. They were approximately 60% literate, the whole island was. Castro decided that they wanted liberation, but one key to that was literacy. And he promised when he stood before the United Nations that Cuba would be 100% literate in 1 year's time. Cuba was 100% effectively, which means about 98, 99%, in 9 months' time. They finished 3 months early. They did that with mainly teenagers who were formed into something called literacy brigades. And they went out in the countryside and taught their elders and peers how to read. and they didn't have computers, and they didn't have textbooks. They didn't have PhD degrees in reading. They did not have research-based programs. They didn't have data-driven curriculum. They had the intent to teach and the intent to liberate. And on the strength of that, they persisted. And so I'm really citing that as one of the highest standards, but even that standard is not high enough. You know, once you understand where African people came from and what was laid down as markers, once we understand that, then we'll see that we have the highest standard on earth already in our cultural tradition, and to strive for anything less than that it might be education for freedom, but it wouldn't be education for liberation. I say all of that in a roundabout way to tell you that it makes one critical impression on me to be in this room right now and to have Brother Shuja and others articulate what it is you intend to do. A couple more comments, and I want to be able to respond to your questions. Brother Shuja mentioned that we had gone into California, and literally we wiped out the IQ test, even today. That was back in 1978. And in 1980, the judge rendered the decision on Larry P. versus Wilson Riles, and IQ was thrown out in California, still thrown out. You cannot give an IQ test to put African children in special education. If you're going to put them there, you got to find another way, because there was disproportion in special ed, part of it due to the way IQ grew. But since that time, we've gone even further, and we had an Academy of Science panel in 1982, and I served on that panel. For the Academy of Sciences, and we looked at IQ again through different lenses, and the shortcomings were noted in that panel report. Also, in 1982, there was a second panel, one on special education, one on testing, and I advised the one on testing. 20 years later, the National Academy of Sciences had a third panel where they looked at the uses of tests and assessment in education, particularly IQ tests and at special education. And without going into detail, the bottom line is it's a mess, that it's bordering on fraud, what we do in the name of assistance to children. But it's certainly untrue that anybody has ever measured anybody's mind. That has never happened, and that's said explicitly, and just the way I said it, in the reports that looked at assessment. And without going into all of that, I can talk to you for days on what the limitations of tests are. I mean, we imitate physicists, but we are not physicists, and we have not been able to tap anybody's mind, and the behavior and achievement of children undermines everything that any advocate of IQ says about what that test does. The behavior of children, meaning that the ones they say are stupid, we find teachers who can make them gifted. In performance, they outperform others. I just had Friday a visit from Brother Tommy Lindsay from Union City, California, Logan High School. And Logan High School is one of the poorest high schools in the state of California. Most of the children, until Lindsay got there, didn't even graduate. Over half of them. That's typical of a lot of our schools, especially urban schools. Our children not graduating. I sat in one graduation in June, and the teacher nudged me and showed me that half the children who walked across the stage didn't get diplomas. And they were the half that were left after 9th grade. So half of them had dropped out since 9th grade, and then the half that finished walked across the stage and picked up a piece of paper, and it was a diploma. It was not a diploma, it was a certificate of attendance. And then the ones that graduated, half of them can't get into the University of Georgia. And they got the diploma. So I mean, it's embarrassing that you would have those kind of schools. Well, Tommy Lindsay came from one of those kind of schools. But he was bringing young men and women that were all suited up. They had their neckties and black suits and everything to compete in forensics at the university, Emory University, a national championship. These young children, he started out with a small number. Now he has over 200 students out of that high school in forensics program where you act and do debate and public speaking and all of that. And they knocked the #1 school in California out of first place, had it for 10 years in a row. And then they came to the national meeting and they took over first place in the nation with these poor kids, who many were so poor they couldn't afford the clothes they needed to stand up and do the debate. And Tommy dug down in his pocket and paid for those children so that they could have shirts and ties and look nice when they went up and kicked everybody's behind in the world. He became Forensics Coach of the Year and got the MacArthur Genius Award of $500,000 discretionary money because of the excellence in achieving. He has kids dropping off the basketball team, dropping off the foot. Can you imagine a black male star on a team dropping off a team to come do forensics? You know, can you imagine that? Well, why would they do that? It had to do with the fact that these kids whose IQs were on the rock bottom were performing at the top competitively with anybody else in the world. So that's why I say I don't have to sit on the stand and testify that tests are bad. I just take the ones they say are dumb and let them beat the ones they say are smart, and then that makes IQ a fraud. So I'm starting there because what I'm saying is that we have in America school systems that are fundamentally a mess for everybody, not just for African children. They're a mess for everybody because the expectations are too low, the goals are inappropriate, they do not have human beings at their center. They do not have spirit at their center. They do not have really world justice at their center. And so we can be sometimes very smart in some of the things we do, but we're not whole as a people, and the schools and the goals for education have something to do with that. So I don't measure what happens with African children against any of the standards that I see. Now, there's another set of standards that our ancestors set that are good for humanity, and one day the rest of the world will understand those standards, and we'll be pushing everybody to the standards we're talking about. You read some of them there. Truth, justice, righteousness, order, reciprocity, harmony, balance, and so forth. The Ma'at standard. And you talked about others that are going to be important to us. So liberation in education means that we can reframe the standard. We're not held down by anything. Don't let anybody give you language and tell you that that's what your goals are. That's why I don't accept the language of No Child Left Behind. You know, I'll mention it, but it's not that's not on my radar screen. I can't get excited about that. We have, for example, and then I'll shut up because otherwise there'll be a monologue and a speech. We have just to put a fine point on this appeal to heritage. Some people think that we do that because we just feel so bad that we don't have heritage, we got to go back and get it. No, we do that. I do it because I want to be whole. And I can't be whole with what I'm given as standards around here, you know. So when I go back, it means I got to look at what were we doing before people came to get us and put us on those ships. You know, what kind of education process did we have in place before enslavement, before colonization, before segregation, and so forth? I went all the way through school. I graduated from high school in 1951. And in 1951, going all the way through school, nobody told me what we did before we got here. Anything in the library about us, African people, Started with slavery. Then I went to the university, all the way through the doctoral program. Nobody in any course in the doctoral program. And I had wonderful professors. They liked me. I was one of their favorites, and many of them were my favorite, even to now. People that I admired and respected and so forth. And they were trying even to do justice, but they didn't have the knowledge to finish doing justice. They didn't know what my people were doing before we got here. You say, well, what difference does it make? Well, once you see what they were doing, then you'll know what difference it makes. If you go anywhere on the African continent, and you can go there in several ways. You can go to the old records, that's one way, or you can go to people today who are still practicing the old system and find out what they're doing. You can go to the Nile Valley, of course, you know that. You go to Egypt and ask what they were doing. Go to Ethiopia, ask what they were doing. You mentioned the Jegna in Ethiopia. When you mention that word in Ethiopia, people stop. Anybody who understands it in Ethiopia stops, because if you call somebody a Jegna, tested in struggle and battle, fearless, at the price of their life, they will protect their people, land, and culture. And they always tell the truth. That's what a Jegna is. People say that's just like a god. That's as close to God as you can get in Ethiopia, is to hang out with the Jegna, go and appeal to them to provide you with inspiration, to provide you with information, to provide you with perspective, and to understand why they would look at these people. Skip Gates went there, and he saw some of these people. He stood outside the place where they said they had the Ark of the Covenant, and that's still the case today. The best evidence, I just saw a new program the other night, the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. So he stood out there and asked where the Ark of the Covenant was. And the guy said here, he said, well, could I have a piece of it? And so I could take it back and have it analyzed to find out if it's carbon dated to a second. He said, man, you can't have a piece of it. Oh, he's fine. He said, yeah, but I'm from Harvard. He said, just because you're clever doesn't mean you can see God. I would have taken that part out of the picture, but he left it in. He left it in the movie. But I'm just trying to give some sense of quality now. And I'm looking at my little children here in Harlem, here in Brooklyn, here in Atlanta, and everything coming out of the Bankhead area. They don't see themselves connected to that Jegna that I just got through speaking about, see? Why? Because their own people don't know about it to pass this information on. Or I can shoot up the Nile and look at not just the pyramid, but what was the mindset that produced the pyramid? What was the value system? What was the methodology? What was the creative spirit and so forth? You can read about it. All their texts are, not all, but many of their texts that will let you have a window on how they thought and what they did, you can read right now. You can pick up the Rhine Mathematical Papyrus, is what they call it. Really should be called the Amos book, because he's the guy that wrote it. That you would write, you would name a book after the man who purchased it rather than the one who wrote it. The Scotchman who bought it was named Ryan. The man who wrote it was named Ames or Amos. So it's the Amos book, if you want to call it by somebody's name. But that particular book, look inside the book and see what's in it. Look at the math problems that go all the way up to pre-calculus. And then know the date of 2,000 years before Christ. Calculus in the Nile Valley with African people doing it. 1,500 years before Pythagoras did the Pythagorean theorem and everything. The child in Harlem, the child in Brooklyn, the child in Atlanta know that his people were doing mathematics and the scientific method in that same papyrus. You can go look at it now. This is not a rumor. This is the text. I'm reading the text on the wall. Go to the British Museum. The text is stretched out on the wall, almost 30 feet long. And you can see every problem. If you read glyphs, you can read what I just said in the text. We don't have to make up stuff. We don't have to fake history for anybody. All our stuff is still there to be seen. And then the last thing I'll say was we were talking about the conference we just had, where a young man, the place where they have the Dogon system right next to the Arabic system, which contained the two Timbuktu manuscripts. So there's a whole lot of things going on in the Niger Valley. Leave the Nile, go to the Niger, and ask, what were they doing to raise their babies in the Niger? And so now you got these manuscripts. This manuscript, you got the young man who brought him, he brought him out of his family's collection. Any professor, like here at the university, would go home and have 1,500 minimum books like that in their house. So these are the family libraries that got passed on. These family libraries got passed on. Families now that in the university have been closed for 400 years. But here are people that still preserve the libraries that the family had. And you have so many family libraries still preserved that you got 80,000 manuscripts in Timbuktu now. When Skip Gates went to the archive, they have 18,000 in the archive. But you have 80,000 more, which brings it up to more than 100,000 manuscripts in Timbuktu right now. And that's just the ones in Arabic. That doesn't say anything about the Songhai literature, the Dogon literature. Doesn't say anything about that. We're in the same place. You got 1 million of these manuscripts in Mali. So the people who came, some of them came from Mali to South Carolina as slaves on slave ships, who were teachers in Mali. They didn't bring savages, pagans to the U.S. They didn't bring them there. They brought intellects as well. They brought people that did everything. Some of them grew right. They might not have been teachers. Some of them were professors and so forth. You got children in Brooklyn, the children in Harlem, the children in Bankhead Court in Atlanta. When they wake up in the morning, do they have that memory to for them to gauge who they are and what standards are? So that when people start talking about these minimum competency standards, and then even saying now, even at the minimum, you can't make it by 2014. I just got one article that said that if they did everything in the world that they could do, there's not a prayer that the children of America could reach the No Child Left Behind standard that people are trying to promise right now. Most people believe it can't happen. He wrote a book, Bell Curve, that 1/4 of Americans are so dumb. That means that there's somebody other than black people they're talking about, because we're not 1/4. They're so dumb that no amount of education will ever enable you to get a job, earn enough to pay back the cost of what it took to put you through school in the first place. That's the place where you enter. That's the place where your enthusiasm will take you to confront. And once you know what happened before, you know what can happen again. And so what you become is the agent of renewal. And that agency of renewal means that you pull on the pedagogy of the ancestors, and you put that at the disposal of these children right now. And that's why when Baba Shuja said that I look at schools, I have been looking at schools for better than 50 years to find the ones that counter the myth. You know, I shouldn't have to do that. I shouldn't have to spend one day proving that schools can teach something. But we live in a culture where you got to do it. You know, all the energy that I spend trying to prove that is energy I can't spend finding the content that I need to know. See, I'm sitting up buried in the process because that's how the problem has been framed. And so I'm sitting inside this matrix of framing of problems. And that's the prison that all of us are in, not just the ones that are the victims of it, the ones that are perpetrators and the ones that are dealers in the game without knowing what the game is, are inside this matrix. And teacher education is a contributing force, as it has been conceptualized. It's a contributing force to the matrix that's got us in prison. You know, to sit up and talk about, you know, I'm a big fan of Head Start. I still support it and so forth like that. But that's part of the matrix too, Head Start. Kids aren't getting a Head Start. Never got it. The Head Start program never produced a Head Start. If they produced some good teachers, some great teachers, and a lot of people came through it and became teachers who were teachers, assistants. Head Start did a lot of wonderful things, but the one thing it didn't do was get kids a head start. Let me give you an example of why. This is the month right now. Tomorrow starts the month when the notices go out in Atlanta, I suppose here, to the parents who applied to put their babies in the high quality elite baby Ivies, they call them. Baby Ivies? Ivy League?
Yeah, sure.
Ivy League kindergartens.
Mm-hmm.
Billionaire, millionaire parents put their children in preschool. That's the Head Start.
That's right.
Giving kids numbers, shapes, and colors at 4 years old is not a Head Start. That's catch-up. But if I give you catch-up and call it Head Start, then when I come back and you get behind, I say, even though I gave you a Head Start, you fell behind. So you can use what you gave me to work me with. If I don't know that your children had a Head Start, you gave them baby Ivy training. You gave them super baby training. I'm not sure that that's the way to train a baby. In fact, I'm sure that's not the way to train a baby. Shouldn't be pushing babies to do certain things at certain ages anyway. But I'm just talking about the political side of it, not the pedagogical side of it. Well, I'm going to shut up right now and just let you know I'm happy to be here, and I'd love to hear whether you got any questions or not, and or even statements that I could react to. Yes, sir.
I do have a question. I really do feel like we are caught in the matrix. My plan is to actually play the school that's at while they do it,
Okay.
and possibly start my own school so we can teach using the principles of math. But where do you start? Like when you don't have that information, or you don't have when it's not given to you from home, and you're just out there. Other than being here at other scholars, where's a great place to start learning?
But that was what I was going to say next, would be at Medgar Evers. I trust this place. I know who's here, and I know who's in charge of the program and everything. And I know something special is going to happen here. But beyond that, there are a couple things that I would urge. I guess it was 3 years ago, we had 4 national meetings where we convened educators, winning educators. Some of these people like Tommy Lindsay that I talked about, he was at the meeting in California, the one that brought the forensic kids and so forth. Can you imagine a whole program of nothing but people like that? You can't be on the program talking theory. You could only be on the program if you did what Tommy did, okay? So one of the places where that's been happening for almost more than 10 years now, Wade's in Sakasumsum has been going on for more than. Sakasumsum is an Akan word, meaning touch the spirit of the African child in Sakasumsum. So every year now, for over 10 years, in San Francisco, at San Francisco State, they've had at least a week of convening all these people that if they're not Japanese, they are approaching it very soon. And it's one of the most extraordinary conferences in professional work, and it's more than, mainly because it's more than professional work. None of us, at least I'm a professional, but that's the least of what you can say of what I want to be. You know, I have a higher calling than just a profession. I'm doing more than getting a job, in other words. I don't want to just be expert at getting a job. I want to fall back into the kind of tradition. Well, that's what was collected at that place. Carrie Secret, the sister that's in the Ebonics program, whose kids are the highest achieving kids in Oakland, in spite of what the newspaper said, that they were teaching Ebonics in the school. You don't have to teach the kids Ebonics, they know it. They're experts in it when they come to school. You have to teach them standard English, you know, so they can be bilingual. And so that's what Oakland was saying, and that's what Secret did. And her kids get up and they perform. And so we had a whole bunch of people like that. Science teachers, math teachers, and stuff like that. That was one. Then, inspired by that, we had in Sakasumsum at Atlanta, in Georgia. And we got another collection with some overlap of people like that. Then Lisa Delpit got one on Educational Excellence Expo in Miami at Florida International University. Did the same thing. Then Freya Rivers, Dr. Freya Rivers, who had been in Lansing, Michigan, and head of a school called Sankofa Shule, which they turned into a charter school, African-centered charter school. She now conducts, or did conduct, two of these Insaka Sum Sum type things, but she called hers something else, Sankofa Conference or something. And we pulled another set of these people together and had church again. So we had church 4 times in 1 year. And that's the place where you have to be. You have to network, because the fundamental of staff development, let me say this, because it'll fit into what kind of institution you have to build in order to build what ought to be built in teaching, and teaching teachers how to teach. The fundamental flaw in teacher education, structure, and even purpose to some extent, the fundamental flaw is that masters are not training teachers. That's the fundamental flaw. It doesn't matter how they do it. It matters whether Tommy Lindsay is teaching a teacher how to teach, whether Carrie Secret is teaching a teacher how to teach, whether Freya Rivers is teaching a teacher how to teach. See, Freya Rivers School, they had the highest achievement in Lansing, Michigan, and top 10% in the state of Michigan in an African-centered public school. That's who should be teaching teachers how to teach, wouldn't you say? And Audrey Bullard in Kansas City, African-centered public school. The city got $2 billion. They didn't get a penny. They are the highest achieving school in Kansas City, top 10 schools in the state of Missouri. Audrey Bullard ought to be teaching teachers how to teach. See, that's what a master is. Now, we define in teacher education, when I was dean at San Francisco State, and we had master teachers that we would assign our teachers to, except they weren't master teachers. They were available teachers. Available teachers is, I got 400 teachers that I want to train this year, and I want to put them somewhere. Would you please take some of these students and be their supervisor? And we call them a master teacher. That's not a master teacher. The only thing that you can call a master teacher is one who moves children to levels of excellence. If our teachers, every one of them, we have millions of people teaching children now. What if all of them had been exposed to master teachers? We would revolutionize schooling for everybody overnight. So that's the fundamental flaw. So your answer is, I think, you find one of these networks. I gave you an example of 4. There are more. We have a JEGNA collective now in Atlanta that we put together to have internships for people who ask questions like you just asked. So if you were in Atlanta, then I'd be over at your house and dragging you to the JEGNA collective. And we have young people, we have about 15 people who committed to going through a 5 to 6 year process until they just used up everything that they could learn from everybody who was in this collective. And it's hooked up to First African Presbyterian Church, which is an African-centered church, and the collective is attached to that and to some of the people in the other places. So that kind of network, or and maybe you start your own network as a supplement or in place of, and never be timid about getting 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, and starting a cell, you see, and then pulling on what you can from some of the other people. Now, I had a class I just taught last semester after all the years at Georgia State, 25 years I've been there. And so I just taught a class on excellence in education. You can't, if you come to my class, that class, you cannot talk about anything bad about school. I don't want to hear it. You can only talk about success. Only people, only the JEGNAs, only the JLAs, only the SABAs, that's, you got to know them And that's what we examine. We examine the theory, the practice, and so forth. In that one class, that's the only thing that's permissible to discuss. If you want to talk about failing schools and failing kids and kids being left behind, you do that in somebody else's class. But we ain't got time for it because we know that there's another kind of lesson that can be learned from focusing only on excellence. So you could actually put together that kind of thing. I gave you my syllabus, and we got I gave everybody a CD with a couple hundred examples of excellence and stuff like that. So you can put it together and make it into what you need it to be.
What about in a system that's sluggish? For example, there's been a bill that's been passed in Congress in '97 including an underground railroad curriculum, but there's been no movement. It's not true. So it's actually being taught in the classroom. There's a program. That program's being taught.
Yes, Dr. Ruggiero.
So, but I mean, is it done across the city? That's my thing. '97 is 2007. It's 10 years later. I haven't seen many examples of it going on. But that's 10 years, right? Like, how do we get around things like that?
Schomburg did the curriculum on the Underground Railroad curriculum.
Mr. Schomburg?
Schomburg.
They did it already.
People, I mean, is it in every public school that
It's
we
not
know
being
of?
It won't be.
implemented.
It won't be.
Why not? That's my thing. It's been already since '97.
Dr. John Howard Clark, our mentor, who you know very well here, used to say, powerful people never teach powerless people how to take their power away from them. So if we wait for it to happen in all the public schools, it's not going to happen. That's why each of the initiatives I just described to you, we took charge of that process and put it where it could work. In most cases, it's outside the school. We do have some examples inside the school where for a period of time you can do stuff. We had 10 years in Portland, Oregon, where we put together history curriculum to teach our children and others about African people. And then the window closed. It opened and it closed in 10 years. We had 10 years in Detroit, Michigan, to do some things in special education that had never been done before. And at the end of the 10 years, the window closed. So if you're working inside public school systems, they're sluggish, they're bureaucratic, you got too many heads trying to drive it, you know, they're national, and corporate now, that's the worst part of it. So what you have to do is peel the children off and peel yourselves off and create liberated space where you can do what you got to do. And then what you'll find is those same places will be so attracted in some cases to what you do that they'll come looking for you.
Viney, Black New Yorkers for Educational Excellence is an organization, and they have proposed 2 years ago
Yeah,
the school that was talking about, but it was denied.
I got a lot of war stories that are similar to the ones that you're talking about, but you can't stop there, you know, because there'll be periods where you want, for example, the Atlanta Public Schools had a New York school superintendent there for 2 years, Jerome Harris. He went to Atlanta Public Schools and actually came to a National Alliance of Black School Educators meeting and came to one of our seminars and got it all inspired. Said, I'm going to go take an African curriculum back to the Atlanta Public School System. And for 2 years, we had a model thing, because when he went back, he said he wanted $100,000, and one of the board chairman said, no, you cannot have $100,000. You have to have $1 million. So they upped the ante. Everybody wanted to jump on board, and they did it. And they did a wonderful job. We had 2 conferences, actually 4, but there were 2 main ones. African infusion of African content in school curriculum. That's what we had. Two big conferences in Atlanta on that. And the $1 million went to release teachers and to pay for consultants to come in and take the curriculum that was brought to the district and put it in place. 2 years later, they shut it down, you know, by firing him. You know, and nothing has happened before our sense in the Atlanta public school system to address the curriculum issue. However, some of the things that were produced during the 2-year period are still there. Like we have videotapes that went out. They play them every February. Public schools play the videotapes we did that called African American History, A Second Look. That's a series. I forget how many videotapes that were made at that time. So the legacy is still there. The bibliographies are still there. Some of the written materials are still there. Some of the people are still there. But formally, the district gives no support to it whatsoever. What years was it? I can't remember.
91,
Yeah.
Yeah.
He came from the district right next to this one.
Yeah, yeah.
13
Yeah.
in Brooklyn. He was the superintendent.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to live in Atlanta, that's why.
Yeah, yeah.
The dilemma of the prospective teachers, because here is an institution that is conscious of the strategies as per African American children, and then these students are exposed to it, and they're willing to go out there and be agent to change to implement these strategies. However, for example, in New York City, where teaching strategies are scripted, and if they don't follow that scripted mold, they're being the master teachers or assessing them as per the scripted curriculum. What do they do?
You put your fingers on, I don't know what that's the tip of the iceberg. And you've identified the critical problem right now. Because let me tell you, the scripted instruction is a part of something called school reform. Okay? And school reform, you have to ask who formulated school reform and how did it get to scripted instruction from school reform? They started because schools weren't achieving well. Then they went to prescription of what they could do to fix it. So they say, what you got to do is you got to, first they named the problem. You got to reform the school. Well, that was the first error. You didn't have to reform the school. That assumed the form was bad and that you had to go find a good form that you hadn't had or heard of or knew about before. Old forms can work. You know, my dad was a high school principal in segregated Texas. I was born in Texas, Bay City, Texas, little country town. But he had one of the highest achieving schools in the state of Texas with the old form. And lots of teachers are working with the old form. New forms are good, and it's good to have new forms, but to pin your strategy on the idea that form is the problem, when politics was the problem. It had nothing to do with form. But you deflect attention from politics by preoccupying people with a search for the magical form. And so the form then evolved into, it evolved at a time, school reform took place at a time where you had, starting in 1980, the takeover of the radical right. Now, what does that have to do with how schools are? Well, the radical right, one of their agendas is privatization. So the way you got to what you're talking about, scripting, is that certain language, again, language will kill you. Certain language got brought in under school reform because they said you got to have evidence that your reform is working. So they started talking about research-based school reform. Okay, now, as soon as you say research-based, that's socially desirable, but not necessarily effective. In fact, it can be harmful, and is harmful, the way it's used, the way it's implemented. Because the person who, and I could give you the name of that person, who made up that word, also made up the criteria for what constituted research-based. And research-based meant that you had to have a whole bunch of the same things with a large sample. Because some people can't imagine research on an N of 1. You know, that one sample. where like an ethnography research, where you can take one person, one school, one teacher, but not in national policy. National policy, if you say research-based, they want somebody who's got a program. There's another word. You got to have program, and you got to have 50 instances of it, 100 instances. If you got 200 schools involved, and you do research on progress in 200 schools, then that means that once you get 200 schools, your gains aren't going to be that big. They're going to be little bitty gains. So little bitty gains are going to be called success. In fact, one of the research-based programs in reading is called Success for All, and it's failure. Success for All is a failure. But it's called success. Why? Because you get, in the first 2 to 3 years, usually 3 to 4% better achievement if you use Success for All than in your control group. They don't tell you what happens in year 4, 5, and 6. And that many of the kids, teachers don't like it. Nobody, you sending these warriors out there, and somebody's going to tell them what question to ask, when to ask them, what books to read, and so forth. And here's the bottom line. The reason I say the tip of the iceberg, I'm trying to describe a whole context of bad stuff that's passing for good stuff. Because you got a lot of good people behind bad stuff because they're confused. The scripted programs are educational apartheid. It's the new apartheid. You will not find it in the wealthy school districts. You don't see scripted. Those parents are not going to have it. So this is the new segregation. Mostly black children, brown children, poor white children get scripted programs. That's the bottom line. That's segregation. And it's invisible segregation because it goes under the name research-based program, reform, got all this language that covers up what's happening. And so that means they sucked all the air and space out of the place where you're sending these warriors out to work. There's no room for them. So right now, my best students, I got some great students in Atlanta Public Schools, great teachers in Atlanta Public Schools. And many of them are quitting. You know, they have to go to war. You know, that you have to decide that you're going to confront your principal. You're going to. I'm not going to do that. You know, I'm going to do what I know is more powerful, more beneficial for my students. And then that's personal risk that you take. So yes, what you described is absolutely one of those things. But all I can say is we're at war. We're at war, and at any war, there are going to be casualties. And right now, the casualties are some of the best people that we got. I got a paper, if I can remember, to email it back to Brother Shuja. I call it Warrior Master Teachers. And it's a case of two teachers who fought the scripted program thing, who are master teachers in their own right. They raise achievement, but they say, you got to stop doing what works, and you got to do what we tell you to do the way we tell you to do it, because you're not cooperating with the program or something like that. So I wish I know I'm answering this too fast, but you put your hands on something that's a fundamental undermining of any potential for success in school. It will not work, cannot work, and they're doing more of it, by the way. And right now, you got all these corporations running schools. Now, think about that for a moment. You go, and what a superintendent's role is now is to go to the cafeteria of corporations and to get Success for All, Move It, Math, America's Choice. You get something. You go shopping for these people that come in, and then they come into your school district. And so if you can show off to other superintendents and say, yeah, I got one of those, 10 of these, stuff like that. I got the latest, see? The fact that the latest don't work, you know, doesn't matter. So now, but not only that, now you've got a company coming in. You got your faculty already in place. Now you got a private company coming in that's a profit-making company that manages your instructional process. Sometimes that runs your school. You know, Edison School, they're selling management of the school. Success for All is selling teaching to the school. And they're selling supervision to the school. Now, watch this. Y'all had a fight up in here some years ago when Rhodey McCoy was up here over local control of school. Remember? You got no local control of school if corporations are running your school, and the headquarters in Baltimore, headquarters in New York. And I'm sitting in Atlanta, and I go to the school, and I can't talk to the principal because he hired the people to come in and manage the school. And I can't go to the people that came in and managed the school because they're not there and they don't have to talk to me. They don't have parent participation in their contract. You see what I'm saying? So where you used to be able to take 5 parents up to the school and complain and get some kind of response, how you going to get a response against that? So that's part of the new matrix that's being created, and it's killing our schools. And until we take it back, and I don't know how long it's going to take everybody to wake up and find out that they got to take these schools back.
By 2009,
Big pardon?
by 2009, if mayoral control should succeed, we will have a force where the government control both non-monetary and monetary aspect of
Hey,
school.
there's 2 forces. You got, it's so funny, you got mayors running schools, and they can't run cities. You know, and so now we got them running schools. You got in 1980, almost every major school system was run by African Americans in a large city. You had New York, you had Chicago, you had Philadelphia, you had all of those, and so forth. Not that the school system just had to be run by an African American, but those African Americans had doctoral degrees in education. And it's not that anybody has to have a doctoral degree in education, because I know a whole bunch of people with PhDs in education and do it devil, you know. But now, since 1980, there's been a revolution. And that revolution says that anybody but somebody with a degree in education can be a superintendent. So now you got in Philadelphia, the man that came from Chicago, that's a businessman, an accountant or something, and he left Chicago and left another accountant in charge, and he's an accountant in Philadelphia running the school. You got a banker running them in New York. You got you had a ex-governor, a good guy, in Los Angeles running the school. You had in San Diego prosecuting attorney for the state of California. He's the superintendent of schools in San Diego. You got an ex-governor in Oakland, California. I'm just telling you, all of a sudden you moved all of those people who were educated out. You had a general in Seattle. You know, all of them got moved out, and they said, we don't trust education people to do these things for kids. Now, are schools better? No, but you have lost the leadership role in schools, and so they bring a whole different head, you know, to schools. You know, the military person is going to want to run it like the Army. The bank is going to run it like the bank. You know, the accountant's going to run schools like an accounting system. The lawyer's going to run it like law school, and so forth. But none of them going to run it like human institutions. So that's a serious problem. But what you got now is 2 things. You got all the non-educators who almost exclusively are in charge, and at the same time, what they're doing is what the other guy was doing too. They're just buying the corporate program, and many of these are in the same political party as the people who own the companies that are selling services to schools, and some of them are the same ones selling services to prisons. And so we get the same thing happening, you know, that what we get is that our people in prison become the things which need management, which then makes profits for people. And now we get our people in schools with some of the same companies doing some of the same thing. It's a funny time, but again, if you wake up, you know, then maybe we could mobilize and take back some of it and get a chance to speak to our children. Most communities, my community, can't speak to their children. If I go up around the corner to my house to a school, they don't want the PTA in there. You know, what they want is the superintendent, state superintendent, and other officials to come in and pat them on the back because they purchased the right reform program. That's what they want. They don't want to hear from families that are saying, the one reform program I like a lot is James Comer. Got the Comer Project, and the reason I like it is that it's not an instructional program. There's a lot of ways to teach kids, more than one way to skin a cat. The reason I like it is that the James Comer program is about relationships. He's a psychiatrist. He said, what's wrong with schools is you got to build trust, you got to build bonds, you got to build care, you got to build concern, and all of that. And what happens is he's getting the highest achievement, and he's never showed anybody any techniques. How you going to account for that? That's just right up here in New Haven. That's the headquarters for one of those. So this is it's a very complicated thing, and all that's going to be going on for a while. But you got to pull your kids out and put them somewhere under the radar. It might mean Saturday school. It might mean night school. It might mean tutorials. It might mean opening the church school. It might mean the fraternities and the sororities doing something other than just simple tutorials and so forth. But I just think creatively, once we know what it is that's going on, and once we know what we got to do, then we can invent some different ways to take back part of this thing and do something good for our kids. But no, it's war though. It's war. All of these things are war because nobody cares about the kids. Let's face it. All this crocodile tears about the children being left behind. Most people care about their political careers. They care about the money-making companies and so forth. And even if they don't hate the kids, they don't care about them. They don't like them. You know. So quit thinking that somebody's going to care more about your kids than you do. I don't. I know that I care a lot about mine, and I'm going to do everything I can in my power to make sure that they get what they're supposed to get. Yes, ma'am.
I want to know, as we prepare to go out to educate, how do we not, or how have you not lost the fire once you get, or how do you prevent from getting caught in the matrix? Because you come out with ideas, or you've already you've gone through the process of awakening, so you know about the principles of Ma'at, and you know all these things, and you're already equipped with that. But once you get in the actual setting, what do you do not to get beat down so that you get discouraged because you desire to make a difference?
Yeah, it's a good question. What I do and what I think most people do, whether they think about it or not, is it's who you hang out with.
Thank you.
Where you did that, right? That's what I want to know, what he thinks of me. I want to know what's on his mind. You see, I mean, we've been in a lot of things together. We just do the Millions More movement thing. That was our last little project. We were part of 5 people on the education committee for the Millions More movement, and so we did a think tank, a little mini think tank, and we produced a position paper on what the education and socialization process ought to look like. I'm going to tell you now, you ask, what do you do? Well, what I do is find every opportunity I can where we can solve problems together. Because we are corrective on each other. We educate each other. We inspire each other by having those kind of opportunities. So it's who you hang out with. And it's a bigger network than what I just mentioned in the 4 or 5. And it's informal, you know, but it means that you have to be aware that that's what you want to do. And there's a bunch of good people around the country that are ready to give their all. And so that's who I want to hang out with. If I find somebody killing kids, I put distance between myself and them. And you know, there's some people I won't even talk to. I'll sit in a room like this. I won't say a word if I'm in the wrong place, because I'm not going to waste time. You know. So I'm very careful in who it is that I'm getting ready to hang out with, and all it takes for me is, that's why I said what I said when I came in this room. When I heard what was said in the introduction about what you're trying to do here at Medgar Evers, then all kind of bells went off in my head, and my heart warmed up, and my energy. I was sleepy when I got in here. It woke me up. That's what happens. You know, you go to the JEGNA meetings, you go to those things that I was talking about. You meet people and stuff. When I said notice I didn't say we had a professional meeting. I said we had church. Remember I said that? I meant that. That's what it's like when especially education. Education is the most spiritual thing on the planet. And when you get people who are serious about it all in the same place at the same time, and the ones achieving on top of that, that's church. That's church. And that's how I stay amped. I've been watching Crump records, you know. Y'all seen the Crump 1.0, Crump 1.2, Crump LA, they got it out there now. It's fun. Go on the internet and get all the Crump. They about Crump 1 up to about 8 different DVDs. So they got, first you get bucked, then you get angry. Y'all have bucked me up when I came in down, man.
I'm very sorry that we're going to have to end this because the class ends at 4:30 and there will be another group coming in. And on behalf of the candidates of the Education Department and my colleagues and Dean and our colleague in the Center for Law and Social Justice and in the Arts Department, we'd like to give a small token of our appreciation for making the conference.
And I would like to say something too. For those of you who are present who have never sat with Nana before, aka Asa Hilliard, Dr. Asa Hilliard, I hope you know that probably the next time you see him at one of these education conferences, you'll be spending $1,000 to $2,000 to get in the room. Appreciate greatness.
Thank you.
Take one more question.
Yes.
Behind you. Were you trying to answer a question?
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I was.
I'm sorry.
I was trying to ask, like, where as a parent, as a teacher also, but as a parent, do you go for the outside resources? Because, you know, you're saying that, we're all kind of saying that school is failing our children. So where do we go for those outside resources to enhance their intelligence?
Right. See, Baba Shuja had his, I don't know whether y'all read his book or not. Sometimes people write books and they don't require their own book. You know, I don't require my own book. But his book, Too Much Schooling, Too Little Education. And some of the words I use are, he used the word schooling, which is most of what our kids get, and education is what they ought to get. But my brother used a word that encompasses both of those, and I think some more, which is socialization, which is why I use the term social. I stole it from him. Socialization can't happen without the parents. That's right. Which means if you use that term, you automatically require a bond between those who are in the formal position of teaching, but who also may be parents, and parents who are in the formal position of being parents. But what they are collectively is the real faculty for the children's life when stuff is going right. So everything that I know of that where I spend a lot of time, generally we get organizations that in the normal world would be called a professional organization, wouldn't be anybody there but educators. And the psychologists, I'm a psychologist, so the Association of Black Psychologists in the American Psychological Association, I don't expect to see anybody when I go there but psychologists. But when I go to AB Psy, it could be anybody up in there. The same thing with the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilization. Okay, you go to ASCAC, you don't know who's there unless somebody tells you, you know, that some got degrees, some don't have degrees. Some have expertise, some don't have expertise. And it's not necessarily with the degree. Some are family, some are parents, some are students. You know, so to make up a professional organization that's made up of parents, students, community people, anybody, and then you use, if somebody got expertise, you're going to make room for it. So it's not without expertise, but it's also not without the family that experts can function. So I don't really want to go off to APA and leave my family behind. So that's why I go to AP Sci. So I think that's what you have to do is, as a family person, I don't know whether you put yourself in one or both of those categories, but let's say it's a family people who are not inclined to, attend the professional association and stuff like that. They got to partner in some way with the people who are. And we have to, if we're on the side of supposedly, you can tell I don't have much respect for titles at all, none. Not because the titles aren't a good thing, but because there are things more important. And it's function that's more important than title. And so for that reason, one of the things that puts parents off is that we put our titles out there and that don't need to be out there. If everybody's got the same purpose and the same mission, then mission is what we ought to identify ourselves by, I think. And so if we can get parents under that umbrella, and in our JEGNA collective, I told you, that's a much higher level for me than the national board certification and any of the degrees that I got. The JEGNA collective aims at a much higher level than that. Any parent can be in it. So you'll have the highest performance, and you'll have people with maybe less expertise, but they're equal in the JEGNA collective. You wouldn't know if you come to our JEGNA collective who's a professional teacher, who happens to be an engineer, who runs the garbage truck. We got one guy that does that. Who's the janitor. You don't know. And you can't tell by the way they think. Teacher at Patahotep says, do not be proud with your knowledge. Consult with the ignorant and the wise, because the limits of your art will never be reached. Good speech or intellect is more hidden than precious stones, yet it can be found even among the made at the grindstone.
Most parents are considering homeschool. I would like to know your take on homeschool.
The biggest movement in our community. I got a whole file on homeschool. One of my students just graduated with a thesis on homeschool. So she taught me what I know about it. I wish I could tell you. I only learned this last year. I knew about homeschool, but there are homeschool associations, there are homeschool websites, and so forth. And so for many people, what it means is that they just haven't found a place where they feel comfortable trusting their child total education to it, and they're able to take the resources they have and put them through homeschooling. I support that very heavily. But for many children, homeschool isn't going to work because the requirements on parents to do what they have to do is enormous, and sacrifices that parents have to make in order to make that happen. So the masses of our parents aren't going to homeschool. But for those who can, I'm very supportive of that, and we can learn a lot from the people who do homeschool.
Let me just say this, because I know Dr. Mitchell said that a class is coming in here.
I assume, but there are people also have class after.
After
That's
this.
what I was just concerned that.
Okay.
That's what
Well, we want to let you know that you're free to go, but before you go, we ought to formally thank Nana Bafour. Also thank Sister Esmeralda Simmons, because without her and the Center for Law and Social Justice, we would not have this opportunity to share this time with Nana Bafour. And she also wants you to know that this evening's program is 7 in Founders Auditorium. Is free for students, so you can also have some additional time there. That's a 7 p.m.
And the theme is which way freedom? Strategies for the liberation of African people in the 21st century.
And Nana Bafour, is special. It's special because he's one of the people, as he said, is for him what's most important is making sure that we know what we need to know to liberate ourselves, because no one can do it for us. President Wilcox said, if somebody lets you be free, you ain't free. We have to do that for ourselves, and he's a prime example. He is my model. You know, that for the years that I've known him, he's always been available, and I've always been able to learn something from him that I can use. He doesn't play, and I think being here today takes the time out just to speak with us, those of us who are faculty, those of us who are students, but in the struggle, in the war, because we believe that it's important that we educate and liberate. And that's, to me, I was just so overwhelmed, you know, when I learned that this was the model that the teacher education program had adopted, had chosen to identify itself, meaning that the faculty, the students deliberately chose that motto speaks volumes. It speaks volumes. And for students to be thinking about what you're becoming and the role that you're going to play in that kind of conceptual framework is a very powerful tool. And so we're just so very proud of you as a department, faculty, students, and staff for what you've accomplished. And for even being this is a great turnout.
Yeah,
It's a great turnout. And, you know, it's just wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.